This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the After Class Podcast. Today we're continuing our discussion based on the endangered gospel. But before we get into that, I just want to give a little bit of a preview, a little teaser. We mentioned last week that we're going to have an episode upcoming on restoration appreciation. And during that week, we are going to have a guest speaker on our podcast.
Our very first guest speaker.
Very, very first guest speaker. We're really excited about that. From the very beginning, we've talked about having guest speakers, but we haven't made it happen. So now we're going to make it happen.
No one's been willing to come on, just to be honest.
Yeah, lots of people turning us down. Yeah, but finally we got somebody to say yes.
That's not true at all. But
yeah, that's a joke. But we've got somebody to say yes, and we're not going to tell you who. We'll make that announcement next week. So that's our teaser. Get ready for our Restoration Appreciation podcast with a special guest speaker.
And I'm just not sure how we're going to fit 4 microphones in this room.
Yeah, we might have to move to a different location.
Yeah,
Ron's office is not that big.
All right, so as Ron said, we're continuing our series of topics based on my book, Endangered Gospel, How Fixing the World is Killing the Church. And we're kind of moving into the topic of the second chapter. And the second chapter gets at this yearning that we all have inside for a better place. The world around us is obviously terribly broken.
Big time.
We see that in our relationships with one another. We see that in wider public structures, how people wield power and how it hurts and destroys lives. We see the negative effects of sin and death that are laid out in Genesis in the very early chapters.
Hang on there, John. Speaking of Genesis.
Oh, my goodness.
Can't help myself. I got to do it. Don't you have a new book coming out, John?
I have a new book out. That's true.
It is out now. And as I understand, it is a commentary on the book of Genesis. Is that right?
Yeah, the Paulus Bible Commentary, published by Urban Loft Publications. It's just a commentary series that goes through the whole Bible from a missiological perspective. It's kind of a missiological commentary on the Bible, focuses on Christian mission with an emphasis on urban mission. But anyway, I got to talk about Genesis 1 through 11 from a missiological perspective, and that is out.
Fantastic. And where can people get that?
Amazon.com. It's in paperback for only $20, so...
Fantastic price.
I don't have my copy yet, but I was just told yesterday that it's out. So anyway, if you read that commentary, you will see that because of sin, there has been this breakdown of our relationship with God, one another, and creation. And life in this world is tough, and it can be downright nasty, and it leaves us yearning for a better place. And that yearning deep within us for a better place has been central to how people think about the role of the church in this world. What does the church have to do with our yearning for a better place? And so in chapter 2, we talk about some people's yearning expresses itself of yearning to go to a better place. Other people's yearning expresses itself as a desire to make this world a better place. And still for others, this yearning expressed itself in the hope that God will make this world a better place. And based on your view and how you interpret the scriptures, people will frame the nature of salvation and the nature of the church's mission in terms of one of these 3 approaches to a better place. And so what we want to talk about today is just one of those approaches to a better place. We're not really going to talk about what my chapter says about this. We're just going to have a conversation about this because it's an interesting conversation that remains a live conversation in our churches today. And that is the view that through Jesus, God has made it possible for humans to go to a better place after we die, namely to die and go to heaven. Mm-hmm. And you know, many people think of afterlife in terms of leaving this planet, ascending into heaven to live in a better place for the rest of eternity. And our question is that the biblical way of framing the church and the gospel and salvation?
I'd say before you get to the Bible, you've got the hymnal, which could give you a lot of answers. There are a lot of songs that are written about going to heaven. One of John's favorites, I'll Fly Away.
I'll fly away.
Oh, glory.
Oh, glory.
And just the implication where that after we struggle and life is awful, eventually there's something that's going to come and transport us to glory as we fly away. And we're not going to get into all the rapture type situations here that are bound up in that. But there are lots of songs in your hymn books that talk about this thing, that give people great encouragement when they think about it. And there's a certain generation that these songs appeal to, though they're less vogue these days.
And even in Christmas carols. So I think it's Away in a Manger. One of the verses ends with, bid us or to heaven to live with you there.
Yes.
Oh, right.
How does that go?
Yeah.
Something like that. Wow. That's the verse no one ever sings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know exactly which verse you're talking about there, but I can't remember the exact word.
Fit us for heaven. I don't know.
Fit us sounds right.
Fit us for heaven.
Fit bid us for heaven.
Right.
Fit us.
You have enough steps, you can get to heaven.
Oh,
that
my
doesn't
God.
sound right.
Go on that stairway to heaven.
That's a different song, Ron.
Oh, that's not a hymn?
No.
Oh,
Could be.
okay. I'm getting all confused.
So regardless, it's definitely ingrained in a lot of minds and reinforced through song.
Yeah. And reinforced through Sunday morning cartoons or Saturday morning cartoons that I used to watch growing up. I think Looney Tunes had whenever, who was it? I mean, Wile E. Coyote dies in every episode, right?
Over and over, but yeah.
And often he turns into this numinal figure who rises up into heaven with wings.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and as you were talking about the early chapters of Genesis, talking about the breakdown of relationships, humans to God, humans to creation, humans to one another, I really do wonder if that's been fully appreciated in the Western Protestant evangelical tradition. Because most of the time when I hear the problem of sin and the fall discussed, historically, growing up in the church, growing up in the evangelical tradition, the emphasis has been on the breakdown of the relationship between the individual and God, or maybe broadly humanity and God. But as you rightly point out, those early chapters of Genesis have much to say about the breakdown of human relationships with one another and humanity's relationship to the created order. And as the gospel became more and more soteriological, anthropologically centric, there you go, guys. I use some technical terms.
Okay, so our...
Did you use it correctly? That's the real question.
Want to translate soteriological?
Well, the last time I tried to use non-technical terminology to make it clear for people, I got skewered by you guys. So I just can't, evidently, what do you think I do?
So soteriology is the study of...
Salvation, from the Greek soteria, meaning salvation. But soteriological in a very narrow sense of the salvation of the individual.
Gotcha.
And so as the gospel becomes a gospel of you're an individual who's a sinner who needs to be saved, and that becomes like the focus, has that caused people to fail to appreciate more of what's happening in those early chapters of Genesis, and then shape their understanding of what it is that God was trying to resolve and correct, and that ultimately finds its resolution in Jesus and his work and mission? And so has there been a theological agenda that has put blinders on people's eyes that caused them to fail to understand that? Is that part of the challenge that we run into? And has that then shaped people's understanding of their ultimate hope and destination? This world just is a throwaway, and we just want to go to heaven someday. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's been part of the problem.
I think that's very interesting to think about. I think you make a great point. Because then, as you say, if you have this one framework of my personal relationship with Jesus and my personal salvation, then what happens when you get to heaven? I get my personal mansion with my personal this and this, and there's not a lot of, what about the rest of creation? And how does it even feed into it? So
I was
we're
thinking
drawn
of
to certain passages.
my personal cloud.
Yes, personal cloud. That's nice.
My personal cloud with my heart.
Yeah.
Or
I've
my
got one of
guitar.
those with They're Microsoft, so they back up everything.
Yes,
You've
the
got your
cloud.
personal cloud.
Again.
We already have our personal cloud. We don't need it in the afterlife.
Well,
So yeah,
something-
I think you make a great point about how then it shapes the way we even look at certain texts, interpret certain texts, or are drawn to certain texts that may be speaking of the afterlife in some way.
Yeah, and to me, that's a kind of a hermeneutical issue that we have to address. Does our theology shape our reading, or are we able to step back and use Scripture to critique our theology? You know, is Scripture the critic, or is it the slave of our theology? And I think all too often, Scripture becomes the slave of our theology rather than the critic it's supposed to be, that forces us to reevaluate at times and rethink things.
So I think a great place to start to kind of get into is the scriptural hope best conceived of as dying and going to heaven, is to first of all talk about the meaning of heaven. You know, terminologically, what does heaven mean, and how is it used in the Old Testament? How is it used in the New Testament? And I think getting some definitions out there, I think, could be really helpful. I'm going to kick it over to Sam the Hebrew word for heaven
Is the heavens. I was like,
Oh, Hebrews use that exact heaven.
Shemayim, right?
Oh, there we go.
Yes, in Hebrew, the heavens, heavy No, Shemayim, which is just up there place, is really what it comes down to. There are different levels. There's it could be the sky, it could be the realm above the sky. There's not clear terminology of that place that you go when you die. It's just we've got down here, and there's stuff when you look up that's up there. And Shemayim could describe any of that. Also, the dwelling place of God.
Yes.
So there's that to start with.
So the place where the birds are,
The sky.
the place where the stars are,
and planets are. That's Shemayim.
the place where God and any other heavenly
other-
beings are, the place of their abode, which I think ancients would have thought is, if you got up there far enough past the stars, or even among the stars, the recesses of the stars, you might run into the place where God and his angels are.
And isn't that the expectation of the builders of the Tower of Babel, that if we can build a tower high enough, we can ascend to the heavens, to the dwelling place of God or the gods or the heavenly beings?
Well, that's a notion I challenge in the commentary.
Okay, that's fine. I'm open
Wait,
to
you have a
correction on
commentary
that.
out?
Really? Did you write a book about this?
Well, the notion, they're building a tower into the heavens. It's very impressive to build a tower that reaches up into the sky. Doesn't mean they were trying to reach God.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that.
I stand corrected.
Necessarily.
Necessarily.
But the idea in the ancient world was God was up there somewhere. So you have, Zeus on Mount Olympus and all the rest.
right.
It's up. He's up. The gods are up there somewhere.
And it's kind of a tiered place where you have the lower heavens, that's where the birds fly around, the higher heavens, clouds, and then stars above that. And if you ascend high enough, like you guys said, you get to the dwelling place of God.
So does any of that change when we get to the New Testament of how the word heaven is used? So you want to throw some Greek out there and define
I'm
it?
happy to. So in Greek, the term is uranos. And what's interesting in the New Testament is how often that is plural. In fact, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew loves the term kingdom of heaven. He's rather unique among the gospel, or even the New Testament writers in general. Others seem to prefer the kingdom of God in describing the kingdom that Jesus preached. Matthew really prefers the term kingdom of heaven, but in Greek it's plural, kingdom of the heavens. And so you still see that plural idea, which probably does reflect still this tiered understanding of the heavens. A similar view where you have strata or layers, and that God's dwelling place, if you look up and could go high enough, you would come to God's dwelling place up there. And so I think in the New Testament you have a similar cosmology, we might say, a similar understanding of the universe and where God dwells.
Yeah, and so things have changed cosmology-wise. We've, through advanced technology and telescopes, we've kind of looked further than the ancients were able to see.
A couple miles.
And we didn't find
God?
God's house. We didn't find angels.
Yeah.
And that discovery or lack of discovery has impacted people's use of the word heaven, or at least their concept of God's dwelling place or abode.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point because we no longer speak of the heavens. Rarely. I mean, it's more poetic than anything. If anybody talks about, the heavens, I think it's more, you encounter it more in poetry. Now we speak of heaven, I think at least as English speakers, solely as God's abode, whereas the sky would be this space around the earth where birds hang out and where clouds exist, and that once you get up above that, now you're up among the stars and planets. That's outer space. And then heaven no longer, I think, has a spatial relationship to us in general. Maybe some people would still think that way.
So you're suggesting there's been a shift from a physical heaven to now it's a spiritual place that cannot be located on a map?
Yeah, I think so. I think of, I remember at a church I was at in Irwin, Tennessee, the preacher talked about heaven. He talked about the abode of God. And, heaven is a word that's used in the Bible to talk about where God is. Mm-hmm. And the people who used it probably meant up there in the sky. Mm-hmm. Now that we've been up there in the sky and didn't find it, and we've found that space just keeps going on, the notion is that God's realm is a different sort of realm altogether. Mm-hmm. And where it is spatially is a mystery to us. It could be a realm that overlaps the realm we live in now. Mm-hmm. It can be a realm that's located somewhere in the heavens. Our telescopes just haven't looked far enough. Yeah. Or it could mean something else. It's a lot more of a mystery now than I think it was for the ancients.
Yeah. I think for the most part, people see it as a something that is in a dimension apart from ours. When we think of space-time, as the physicists talk about it, that heaven doesn't exist. At least most people would think about it this way. It does not exist in a way that can be observed or measured by any scientific instrumentation. And so it exists outside of what we would call space-time. It's an alternate dimension. Even if people don't necessarily use that terminology, I think conceptually that's how people think about it. And to your point, John, that might be right or wrong. Maybe it overlaps more than what people think or less. And so, yeah, there's an enigmatic quality to God's domain, his place of dwelling, that probably defies our attempts to quantify it and to locate it in space and time.
I think it's fascinating that you just said that heaven is more, I forget what phrase you used, it's like more mysterious to us than it was to them. Like, what? We don't understand something better after all these years? I thought we were just way smarter than they were ever could be. Now, that's fascinating to think about.
Well, I mean, that's a great alternative point that sometimes I think we look at the ancients as these, unenlightened hicks. We think that we know so much more, and maybe that is a good point, John. That maybe we fool ourselves into think we know more. Maybe all of our scientific discovery has made it obvious to us that we know less than we think. That's a great observation, Sam.
He made it. I just.
So I think so. Given that this is how the terms functioned back then, both in the Old and New Testament times, and how there's already some slippage because of advanced scientific technology of our understanding of when we use a word heaven to describe God's abode. For us, it's not if you just go a few thousand miles further than the birds, then you're going to get there.
Right.
The notion of heaven has kind of slipped. But the fascinating thing to me when we talk about afterlife or going to a better place, and especially going to a better place, well, I guess I just said afterlife, after we die, is that when people say, I can't wait to die and go to heaven, they mean different things by the word heaven.
Sure.
When they say that.
Yeah.
What meanings have you guys run into that people mean when they say, I want to die and go to heaven?
Yeah.
This eternal existence, usually proximate to God, whether fully in God's presence or perhaps in this space where, and again, it depends on the person. Those who don't really know the Bible very well, but like, I get to do whatever I want for all of eternity. So, man, I can't wait to golf every single day when I die. And God's got a really nice golf course. Or just then there's the old version of, well, everyone gets their own cloud, as you said, and they get their harp, right? This will be in this space, but it's all proximate to God at least.
Yeah.
Like there's a nearness that's going to be enjoyed.
And I think it's a place of permanent habitation. It's funny, the thing that comes to my mind is that, and this is where I always date myself, I don't have any recent pop culture references. And so I don't know how many listeners will remember, or even alive, right, will remember Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey.
Well, that is better than the last reference you had. Okay, keep going.
But, there's this scene where they go to heaven. They escape hell somehow, and they go to heaven. And, they have a conversation with God, and the Grim Reaper's there alongside them because they beat him. But they go there, and there are all these people that they encounter. And I think that probably illustrates the popular conception, even among Christians, is that heaven is not merely the abode of God, but it is our ultimate and permanent destination, our permanent place of habitation. So I think that's what I've encountered most.
Yeah, so sometimes people think dying, going to heaven is, using the ancient cosmology, going up into the sky where they expect God lives, where we're going to live with him. Mm-hmm. Some people use the same exact word to talk about a future in which God comes down to the earth and remodels the earth, and there's a new earth where God lives, and then that's heaven to them, right? And we resurrect to life on a new earth where God is on earth. And for others, I think there's a third option, which heaven is this mysterious third space. Mm-hmm. It's neither up in the clouds nor on a kind of new earth, but in a spiritual realm where we're not weighted down by bodies, and we're not sure where it is. It's just where we're going to be forever. Mm-hmm. And I think it's worth noting that, though Christians use heaven in those wide variety of ways, the Bible doesn't use it in that same wide variety of ways.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if sometimes it just becomes a convenient shorthand that people use it in a non-reflective way. It's just a convenient shorthand to say, I'm looking forward to this better place someday. And heaven just becomes the convenient term. And they don't really stop to think that much about it. They just know it's going to be better than what we have here.
Yeah. And this leads to a massive amount of confusion, I think. The Bible never uses the word heaven as a place to describe where you go after you die. Have you guys run into this?
Not the term heaven specifically. I can't think of a passage where it says, in some way, at any point, we go to heaven. Not with that term, no.
Yeah. The Bible doesn't use heaven in that way. It uses language of resurrection to life on an earthly kind of new earth kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That language is used, and there's dying and going to Sheol. I'm sure Sam's going to introduce us to the Old Testament view of afterlife in a little bit. But in the Bible, heaven isn't used synonymously as the place of the afterlife, wherever that is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how it's used today. The place of the afterlife, wherever that is. And there's a willingness for people to say, and I don't know where that is, but wherever that is, I'm going to call that heaven.
Yeah.
That is highly confusing for people. Because if your exposure, and again, we're entering into an age where there is a high degree of biblical illiteracy.
Big time.
People are not growing up in churches being taught the scriptures.
Yeah.
And not that the churches aren't teaching scriptures, but increasingly people aren't growing up in the church, period. Yeah. And their exposure to heaven or where people are when they die is often becoming a spiritual being that floats upward.
Yeah.
And so when a Christian uses the term, I can't wait to go to heaven after I die, and for them it might mean a new earth where God's presence is manifest in a great way, the people who hear that are immediately thinking how heaven is portrayed in the media, in cartoons, in movies. One of the shows I really have enjoyed watching over the past couple of years is Lucifer. You guys ever watch Lucifer?
No, I've never watched a full episode. I've caught bits and pieces of it here and there.
Funny show. Probably a little too immoral for a lot of people to want to watch. But it's a whole show about the devil. And as you all know, we have a devil obsession here.
We should do a podcast about that.
Someday.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we could do one on our obsession. Maybe.
So I think what we can try to do in this podcast and maybe the next one is to try to talk about when the Bible does talk about afterlife, what kinds of terms does it use? And then how does it line up with the various ways people use the word heaven today? Is it the same? Is it different? Should we be more careful with our language? And what would that look like? So maybe start out with the Old Testament background. And
Yeah, I feel like when we kind of we're talking about the devil, we're talking about was the devil or was there Satan mentions in the intertestamental period, and I said one, and we moved on. I feel that's similar to this. The problem is translations often, I think, give a hint at, they don't use the word heaven like that, but they give a hint at this afterlife place, because there's a word you've been to Sheol that really just means this place that everyone goes to when they die. There's no judgment. There's no good or bad situation. And so the translation might be the grave or the pit, which are okay, but it's kind of ominous. I'm not necessarily sure how you say there's this place where like you just back to the dust of the earth. That's it. Like there's no discussion of soul. All the rest that just doesn't happen for the majority of the Old Testament. So people die, they go to Sheol. In other words, they kind of stop existing. And that's what we see throughout the overwhelming majority of the Old Testament. There are glimpses, perhaps, I wouldn't even say glimpses, I say passages that people bring some baggage to, but the Psalms about, someone going to the right hand of God. See, they're going up to heaven to be with God, or something like that. The only clear reference to any sort of afterlife is found in Daniel 12. And even that, for me, is Daniel's, in my estimation, a kind of a late written book. And so this book and this author's already being influenced by later things that we're seeing as a transition into the New Testament. But nonetheless, it's still there. So Daniel 12:2 says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth. So again, there's this dust of the earth. They've already gone down. It doesn't say Sheol there, but that's kind of the implication that, like everyone, they've gone down there, shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This is the only verse that talks about any sort of a resurrection type situation.
Post-mortem situation.
Yes, post-mortem. But there are a couple of interesting things. There are two different ways to go. There's everlasting life, and then there's everlasting shame and contempt, which, if you didn't have anything in the New Testament, you would know what they're talking about, because there's no mention of hell. And then it also says many of those who sleep will arise. Well, what about the rest of the people?
Does that mean everybody? Yeah.
So, it's so vague and such just a small snippet, it's hard to base any sort of theology based on that, and yet people regularly do. And so it's just a hint at perhaps what we're going to see more of an understanding as we get to the New Testament. But just to summarize, the Old Testament says very little about anything coming close to the heaven that we envision, regardless of your view. It's you die, you go to this place, all of you, good and evil, go to this place called Sheol, until eventually Daniel says, well, maybe some will get a second chance.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reading, what did Daniel mean when he talked about raised? Raised to where?
Right, yeah.
Some people, again, assume raised to earth, and others think of raised up above the clouds, into the place where God lives. It doesn't say the place
Right.
In Daniel 12 of where you're raised. But then we also have the benefit of the rest of the book of Daniel. Like, if you think about the rest of the book of Daniel, there are several visions that are given interpretations, and there's a view, even though it's in apocalyptic literature, and so we have symbolic beasts and images. When you think of the image of the statue, right, with the different metals, and the different metals represent different empires, and we can quibble about which empires different metals stand for. The way that vision ends is there's a rock, right, carved out of a mountain not made by human hands, and it smashes the base of the statue, which comes crumbling down, and that rock becomes a kingdom that fills the earth. Mm-hmm. And righteousness dwells. And this is a vision of God's ultimate salvation.
Yeah.
The kingdoms of this world crumble. They're replaced by a kingdom that fills the earth, where God's will is done on planet Earth. Mm-hmm. And so in the context of Daniel, where the vision of the future that is given to the audience to give them hope is this earth filled with God's kingdom.
Right.
And if Daniel is anticipating being resurrected from the dead, or among the many, and God's kingdom is filling the earth, why would he anticipate raising to go somewhere else? The earth is finally becoming the thing that all Jews have wanted it to become, and Daniel's going to rise and go be with angels in the clouds?
Right.
It's only logical to assume that the resurrection Daniel envisions is one to that kingdom that fills the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if if we understand Daniel being a later work, and I don't know where you guys stand on it, I know some people see it as being produced somewhere around the time of the Maccabean revolt. I don't know, do you guys have an opinion on that, or we want to talk about, is it germane?
2nd century.
Okay.
I'm with, yes.
Okay.
That's an opinion.
Sure, absolutely, just an opinion.
That's right. Just kidding. I kid.
But in the Old Testament, the emphasis on the Old Testament is Israel. What it is to be Israel, living in the land, or when you rebel against God, being removed from the land. And it's around the time of really the Maccabean revolt where, and this is, I understand it, so feel free to challenge me on this, but you're getting into the time of the Maccabean revolt where people are now going to have to face potential death for maintaining covenant faithfulness. In the Old Testament, the idea of covenant faithfulness bringing about being a direct cause of your death, not an issue. But you get to the Maccabean period, and now people are going to kill you for maintaining covenant loyalty.
The pre-Maccabean period. I mean, the Maccabean period is the end of that persecution, and you have Jewish independence.
Right.
So you're talking the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The
Okay,
Greek.
so yeah, I'm probably should be more specific. So pre-Maccabean, before the Maccabean revolt. Yeah, the Antiochus crisis, where you're going to be executed if you do covenant things like circumcise your kids or whatever. And how do you encourage people to maintain covenant loyalty in the face of death? You begin talking about, hey, death isn't the end of the story. Resurrection, reestablishment of a godlike earth, and you get to be a part of that. And so I think there's an understandable shift to the conversation, whereas before the Antiochus crisis, you're not really talking about that much because covenant loyalty isn't going to necessarily bring about death. But once you get into a situation where that is definitely going to happen, now you want to give people a reason to see death as not the end of the story, but death is worth it if something good awaits you on the other side.
Yeah, and this is the rise of the apocalyptic worldview. And, I mean, understanding this worldview, it helps. And apocalypse is not just a kind of literature where you have a lot of symbols and dragons with multiple heads and animals and other things.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Angels with revelations and interpretations. The apocalyptic worldview is really the successor to retribution theology or a Deuteronomistic worldview. And I'm going to explain those words. I mean,
Thank you.
If you read the history books of the Old Testament, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, there's a certain kind of worldview that builds off of the teaching of Deuteronomy. That is, when God's people live right, according to Torah, God blesses them, and things are going well. And when God's people stray from Torah, God curses them, and things go badly. Mm-hmm. And so you can look at how Israel is faring, whether they are living in a blessed state or whether they're living in a cursed state, and say, you must have been naughty lately because things are terrible, the nations are pillaging you, you don't have independence. This is God's punishment on you because you haven't been faithful. And when they're thriving, you can say, God must be blessing you. Mm-hmm. You must have repented. You must have turned things around. You're living on God's path. And so their worldview was things go well for you when you're doing well and things go badly for you when you're rebelling from God's ways. But now you get to the time, and really this was a way of interpreting history. So how could the Babylonian exile happen? Because Israel was not following Torah. That's how the nations can take control. And God would often predict through the prophets, hey, if you don't turn things around, I'm going to raise up this nation, and they're going to pillage you and take over your land. Yeah. This is retribution theology. Israel's getting what they've got coming because they've been unfaithful. Well, now you're at the time of the Greeks, and no prophets have come along and said, you know what, Israelites, you're slacking, you're doing this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. Therefore, I'm going to raise up the Greeks if you don't repent, and they're going to pillage your temple, and things are going to go terrible for you. There weren't prophets who said this.
Right.
Yet the Greeks came along and took over the land, and Antiochus Epiphanes really ratcheted up his persecution of Jews and destroyed the temple, and yet there was no prophetic warning. There was no, here's what you did wrong, and here's why the Greeks are coming. Therefore, you have to repent. They can look at their recent history and said, no one told us was going to happen. We have been being faithful.
Right.
We've been trying to be a Torah-shaped community. No one said this was going to happen, and yet things are falling to pieces.
Yeah.
The formula of Deuteronomy is not working.
Yeah.
Bad things are happening to us, and we can't look to our recent history and see rampant unfaithfulness.
Yes.
So how do we interpret the terrible crisis that we're in light of the fact that we didn't do something wrong to deserve this? And then in comes the apocalyptic worldview that sometimes God lets things get to a certain boiling point in creation. He lets the nations loose for a while to wreak havoc on the earth, but he's got them on a leash, and their tyrannical reign is only going to last so much longer. And then there's going to be a dramatic divine intervention where God breaks into the world history and brings low the nations and restores his people Israel.
Yeah.
It's a different worldview. Israel's repentance doesn't trigger this because Israel's sin is not the problem that triggered the Greeks. They're starting to view world history in terms of God allowing certain things to happen that is beyond Israel's control. God still is in control, and he will bring a decisive end to the world's domineering powers and a decisive restoration of his people.
Yeah.
I think that includes an important shift in understanding. In the Old Testament, what was your reward for a life of living faithfully to Torah?
Long life.
Long life.
Peace and long life.
Yeah, blessing here on earth.
Maybe die well.
Maybe, yeah. And so now it's, what's your blessing for faithfulness to Torah? Well, you might have the chance to come back again. And that's an important shift that is not there in the Old Testament. There was no afterlife reward, that is, for faithfulness. It was just, you live well, God blesses you, you have many children, and things go pretty well for you in the land. And that's it. And you go to Sheol. And they were fine with that.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no
It's hard to imagine that. From a Christian perspective,
Right.
Afterlife has always been the bonus thrown in with faithfulness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you got to appreciate how radical that shift is, that you go from a view that righteousness brings peace, prosperity, and long life on earth to righteousness brings suffering. To be righteous is to suffer at the hands of the unrighteous. I mean, that's a radical move conceptually, and that's exactly what Israel experienced.
So now you have all these Jews who are being radically faithful to Torah, and it's not resulting in blessing. Mm-hmm. It's resulting in death.
Yep.
Martyrdom. It just seems like God is absent from world history. He's not doing anything about it. The whole thing doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And in steps Daniel, one of the latest books of the Old Testament, to say God's not blind and he hasn't lost control of world history. He sees what's going on. He has these nations on a leash. He will take care of them. And he hasn't turned a blind eye to all those faithful Jews who were dying for Torah, for faithfulness.
Right.
He's got something lined up for them in the next life. And the details of that are just not given. And that's really where the Old Testament ends, right? It just, that little speck of hope pops in toward the end chronologically. But I do want to say, and throw this at Sam, well, what about Enoch? What about Elijah? Didn't they die and go to heaven, or didn't they maybe just go straight to heaven?
They did, except heaven may not be heaven. They went up and they disappeared into the sky, is literally what happened to them.
Yeah.
So which heaven is it, is my question.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I would say it's probably not the abode of God. But, yeah, that would be my response. Although Enoch was and then he wasn't, so
Yeah.
I don't even know what that
Yeah,
means.
these are the two big proof texts from the Old Testament that, no. The Old Testament teaches that people go to heaven. What about Enoch? What about Elijah? Were you going to say something?
Well, I wonder if, and this is pure speculation on my part, would the interpretation be that, these two dudes were just so righteous that they had a postmortem experience that was totally different, that they did get caught up to God, but that's not the expectation for every human being. Would people have looked at them as having something that was singularly unique in human experience, or I guess doubly unique because two guys went through it. So,
Well, their experience is different, though. I mean, just like I said, the phrasing is just Enoch he walked on the earth and then he was no more.
Yeah.
And the implication is he kind of disappeared in some way. Elijah disappeared, but Elisha saw him disappear.
Yeah. Yeah, are these exceptional experiences?
They're definitely exceptional,
normative.
but again, I'm not sure they're exceptional to the extent of then going to dwell with God.
Well, yeah, sure.
It's an exceptional experience, but it's not clear that the experience that they're experiencing is going to be with God in heaven.
Sure.
We're not told where Elijah's chariot lands.
Right, yeah.
We seriously don't know.
I mean, that's like Rocket Man. He went up, but he might have come down in America.
Are you talking about the Elton John song?
Exactly.
Or wait, is that Elton John? Am I getting the right one?
We're too old.
I thought you were talking about a Korean dictator.
Yeah. Oh, boy.
And the same with Enoch.
Mm-hmm.
Enoch walked with God, and he was no more because God took him. Well, took him where?
Yeah.
It took. I mean, we're just not told.
Right.
It's we don't have two exceptions of people who go to be with God.
Mm-hmm.
We have two exceptions where someone was taken by God, who knows where, and a chariot goes up into the heavens, which means up into the sky. Unless Elisha somehow got spiritual goggles to see into the realm of God's abode, what he saw looking into the heavens was looking up into the clouds where this chariot disappeared, and we're just not told where it lands. So really, we don't know where these guys go. They cannot be used as a proof text of here we have going to heaven in the Old Testament. Plus, we do have an interesting passage in John 3 that I think is worth throwing in here when we talk about Elijah and Enoch. John 3:13 says, and this is Jesus talking, "No one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven, the Son of Man."
Yeah, fair point. Now, although I do have to wonder, the way John uses language, and Jesus is speaking, obviously, is that a commentary on postmortem state? Or is it more a matter of, Jesus is being figurative and saying, nobody's ever gone up to God and learned anything from him. If you're going to know anything about God, it's the sun coming down. And now I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but knowing knowing what John is trying to communicate there, I wonder if we're reading something into that Jesus didn't actually mean. And again, I'm just speaking off the top of my head. So I'm not sure if that's a commentary on Elijah per se. Yeah. I'm going to have to think about that.
I don't think it's a commentary on Elijah or Enoch, but it is a statement that he thinks they're going to agree with.
Oh,
no one has ascended into heaven.
Yeah.
They didn't say, whoa, what about Enoch? What about? I mean, he's not talking about them.
Right.
But this is a presupposition, right? That they're in agreement. No one has ascended to heaven. That's not a place where people go. It's a place where the Son of Man came from. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of unique.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
So, which is to say, those who go to those two figures in the Old Testament, the text doesn't carry the freight they want it to, I don't think. And what happens to those two is unique, and not necessarily talking about going to heaven to be with God like they're thinking.
Yeah.
That's the point you're making.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and even if we're being overly pedantic, saying, well, it doesn't say he went to heaven. Even if people would look at that and go, well, the implication is he went to be with God. Even if you were to concede that point, I still think you can't use it as a statement of some sort of normative experience. Even if you were to go so far as to say, well, the implication was Elijah went up to be with God. He was unique in that he would have been viewed as somebody who was different, that not everybody experienced that. I'm not saying we have to interpret that way, but even if somebody did, to your point, you can't use it as a statement, a normative statement.
Yeah, it's an ambiguous passage.
Yeah.
And you don't use an unclear passage to support a point.
Yeah, I think that's...
I don't, but...
And it is worth saying that the rest of the New Testament and Old Testament, they do not refer back to Enoch and Elijah as examples of what the rest of us expect to happen when we die.
Sure. Yeah. Fair enough.
Even in the New Testament, when they talk about the resurrection life, they're pointing back to Jesus. Like, he was the first fruits of the resurrection. He was the first to experience the afterlife that we have waiting for us. Mm-hmm. He's not one in a long string of people who arose to experience something. Jesus is the pioneer of the afterlife that we get to experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's a really important point that we've talked about here, that when the Jews begin having a conversation about what happens after death and how do we have a sense of hope beyond death, that it comes back to this idea of resurrection, that it's not disembodied spirits playing harps on a cloud somewhere. But immediately that conversation begins to zero in on this idea of resurrection and re-inhabiting the earth.
So I think we've kind of run to the end of our time for recording today.
Definitely.
And we've gotten to the point of just really briefly overviewing the Old Testament's approach to afterlife.
Yeah.
And Sam, hit it spot on. There was the notion of people descending into Sheol, the grave. And there's a lot more that can be said about Sheol in the grave, but it's the common lot of everyone. And it is thought of as being in the depths, in the deep, underground, the depths of the sea. It's down.
Yeah.
And that's where the good, the bad, the ugly all go there.
Right.
And it's not until Daniel that we have a clear reference to some, at least, being raised to life, presumably in the kingdom that's going to fill the earth at the end of time that Daniel depicts elsewhere. There are a couple of passages, one in Isaiah, one in a Psalm, that and then there's a question that's raised in Ecclesiastes where people use language about maybe a resurrection or people being raised, but those are not clear the way Daniel is clear.
Yeah.
And that's where the Old Testament leaves it, and which sets us up for, I think, next week's podcast. Does Jesus come and reveal something more that helps clarify the biblical vision of afterlife?
Yeah. I think you teed it up well for next time.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this week's After Class podcast, because
the best conversations happen
after class.